"You'll rot in Hirthos," were the last words my 52-year-old son Tyler said to me as he dumped me in that godforsaken nursing home and walked away with his wife to spend a month in Europe on what he thought was his company credit card. My name is Marianne Foster. I'm 79 years old. And after 53 years of marriage, building a pharmaceutical empire with my late husband, Douglas, that we sold for $9 million, I've learned that money has a funny way of showing people's true colors. When Tyler looked me dead in the eye last Friday and told me I'd rot in that place, while he and Melissa jetted off to live the life they deserved, he made the biggest mistake of his life. Because that helpless old woman he abandoned owned 62% of Foster Consulting Group, the $23 million pharmaceutical consulting company he thought he was running all by himself. And he'd just given me exactly 30 days to plan the perfect revenge. You see, when you've lived as long as I have, you learn that the biggest advantage of being underestimated is that nobody sees you coming. They look at the gray hair, the slower walk, maybe the reading glasses, and they think they're dealing with someone whose best days are behind her. Tyler certainly thought that when he had me sign those papers in the hospital while I was burning up with fever from pneumonia 2 months ago. What he didn't know, what he never bothered to find out, was that his father Douglas had structured everything so that I would always hold the real power. "Mari," Douglas told me before he died 3 years ago from cancer, "Tyler's good operationally, but he doesn't have the character for total control. You keep the shares, always. I'm going to tell you exactly how a 79-year-old widow took down her own son and his greedy wife, recovered $3.5 million they stole from me, and sent them both to prison while I sipped champagne in Paris. Because, if you think this story is just about family betrayal, you're wrong. This is about what happens when someone mistakes age for weakness and forgets that the woman they're trying to destroy spent decades building empires. Stick with me through this whole story. Hit that subscribe button, because every grandmother has a tale that needs telling, and mine's just getting started. The signs were there long before that horrible Friday, but when you're grieving the loss of your husband of 53 years, you don't always see the wolves circling until they're already at your door. It started about 2 years after Douglas passed. Tyler had been coming around regularly at first, checking on me, helping with paperwork, making sure I was eating properly. I thought my son was being a loving caregiver. What I didn't realize was that he was conducting reconnaissance, figuring out exactly how much I was worth and how he could get his hands on it. The first real crack appeared 6 months ago when I casually mentioned that I was thinking about updating my will. Tyler's reaction was intense. He started asking very specific questions about my assets, about the trust Douglas had set up, about who had access to what accounts. When I told him I was planning to leave a substantial portion to various charities organizations that help elderly people avoid exactly what happened to me, he got that look in his eyes, the same look he used to get as a child when another kid had a toy he wanted. That's when the visits started becoming more frequent, but different. Tyler would show up with Melissa, and they'd walk through my house like they were taking inventory. Melissa would comment on my furniture, my jewelry, asking innocent-sounding questions about where I'd gotten this piece or that painting. She'd run her fingers along my grandmother's china cabinet and mention how beautiful it would look in their dining room someday. But the real wake-up call came when I caught Tyler in Douglas's old office, going through files he had no business touching. When I asked him what he was looking for, he told me he was just trying to understand the family finances better, in case something happened to me. He said it with such concern, such loving worry, that I almost believed him. Almost. You don't live to be 79 without developing pretty good instincts about people, and something in my gut was screaming that this wasn't right. So I did what any smart woman would do. I started paying attention. Really paying attention. That's when I noticed that Tyler had been asking very specific questions about my mental state to my friends, my neighbors, even my doctor. He'd call them pretending to be the worried son, expressing concern about my memory, about whether I seemed confused during conversations. He was building a case, laying groundwork for something, and I was too trusting to see it clearly. The pneumonia was just the opportunity he'd been waiting for. When I was lying in that hospital bed, burning up with fever and barely able to think straight, Tyler appeared with those papers. He told me it was just a precaution, something every family should have in place, a simple power of attorney so he could help manage things if I couldn't. I was so sick, so grateful that my son was there taking care of everything, that I signed without reading. The biggest mistake I'd made since marrying Douglas 40 years ago. Within days of bringing me home from the hospital, Tyler's behavior changed completely. He stopped asking about my feelings and started making decisions for me. He informed me that he'd already been in touch with several senior living communities, because living alone was becoming too dangerous for someone my age. When I protested that I felt fine, that I'd been managing perfectly well in the same house for 30 years, he just patted my hand like I was a confused child and told me he knew what was best. The condescension was infuriating, but what really broke my heart was realizing that this wasn't sudden. This had been planned. While I was mourning Douglas, while I was adjusting to widowhood, while I was trusting my son to help me navigate the most difficult period of my life, he'd been systematically setting me up to lose everything. 3 weeks before he dumped me at Shady Pines, I was finally feeling strong again after the pneumonia. I decided to check on some of my accounts, just to make sure everything was in order. That's when I discovered that Tyler had already started moving money around, using that power of attorney I'd signed. Small amounts at first, $5,000 here, $10,000 there. Amounts he probably thought I wouldn't notice, or wouldn't remember. But I noticed everything. And I remembered everything. Because the one thing Tyler never understood about his mother was that Douglas hadn't married some helpless flower who needed protecting. He'd married a woman who helped him build a business empire from nothing, who handled the books when money was tight, who made the tough decisions when he was too emotional to think clearly. When I confronted Tyler about the missing money, he looked me straight in the eye and told me I was confused, that I was remembering things wrong. He said the fever had affected my thinking more than I realized, and that maybe it was time to seriously consider getting some help with managing my affairs. That's when I knew for certain that my own son was planning to destroy me. The moment I realized Tyler was systematically stealing from me, something shifted inside my chest. It wasn't just anger, though Lord knows there was plenty of that. It was the cold, calculating fury that comes from decades of business experience. The kind Douglas used to say made me dangerous when someone tried to cheat us. I had to be smart about this. Tyler thought he was dealing with a confused old woman whose mind was slipping, and I decided to let him keep thinking that. But while he was busy congratulating himself on how clever he was, I was going to find out exactly how deep this betrayal went. The first thing I did was call my bank, not the branch where Tyler might have charmed the young tellers, but the main headquarters where I'd done business for 35 years. I spoke to Margaret Williams, a woman my age who'd worked her way up to senior vice president and understood what it meant to be underestimated because of your gender and your age. Margaret pulled all my records going back 6 months, and what she found made my blood run cold. Tyler hadn't just been taking small amounts here and there. Using that power of attorney, he'd moved nearly $200,000 into accounts I'd never heard of. He'd also changed the beneficiaries on several of my investment accounts, removing the charities I'd designated and putting himself and Melissa as the sole inheritors. But that wasn't the worst part. Margaret's voice got very quiet when she told me that Tyler had been in just 3 days earlier, asking very specific questions about how to liquidate my retirement accounts and whether there would be penalties for early withdrawal. He was planning something big, and he was planning it soon. I thanked Margaret and asked her to flag my accounts. Any changes from that point forward would require my physical presence and a secondary form of verification. Then I drove home and did something I hadn't done since Douglas died. I went into his old study and opened the safe. Douglas had always been paranoid about keeping physical copies of important documents. Digital records can be hacked, Mari, he used to say, but paper in a fireproof safe, that's forever. I'd thought it was old-fashioned at the time, but now I was grateful for his caution. What I found in that safe changed everything. Not only did I have copies of all the original trust documents showing my 62% ownership of Foster Consulting Group, but Douglas had also left detailed notes about Tyler's character flaws and his concerns about our son's financial responsibility. There was even a letter addressed to me, to be opened if Tyler ever tries to take what isn't his. Douglas's words from beyond the grave were like a knife through my heart. Mari, if you're reading this, then Tyler has shown his true colors. I've structured everything to protect you from him, but I knew someday he might try to find a way around the safeguards. Don't let him. The boy I raised would never hurt his mother, but the man he's become, well, you'll know what to do. The letter included contacts for Harold Chen, our longtime attorney, and specific instructions for what Douglas called the nuclear option, legal steps that would not only protect my assets, but completely remove Tyler from any position of power in the family business. But as I sat there in Douglas's chair, surrounded by evidence of my son's betrayal, I realized I needed to know more. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about understanding exactly how long Tyler had been planning this, and who else might be involved. That's when I decided to do something that would have shocked Tyler if he'd known about it. I called my neighbor's teenage grandson, Kevin, and asked him to teach me how to use what he called online banking forensics. Kevin thought it was adorable that his friend's grandmother wanted to learn about technology, and he spent 3 hours showing me how to track digital transactions, how to screenshot evidence, and how to use reverse image searches. What I discovered over the next week made me realize that Tyler's betrayal was even more elaborate than I'd imagined. Not only had he been systematically draining my accounts, but Melissa had set up a consulting company that was billing Foster Consulting Group for services that didn't exist. They'd been stealing from both sides, taking my personal money while also embezzling from the business. The final piece of the puzzle came when I found Tyler's laptop open in my kitchen after one of his visits. He'd been so confident in my technological ignorance that he hadn't even bothered to log out of his email. What I saw there nearly knocked me over. Messages between Tyler and Melissa going back 8 months, discussing my deteriorating mental state and how much longer they'd have to deal with the old lady. Detailed discussions about which nursing homes would ask the fewest questions about family members who never visited. Research into how to challenge a will based on mental incompetency. And then, the message that made my hands shake with rage, Tyler telling Melissa that once they got me safely tucked away somewhere, they'd have free access to liquidate everything. He estimated they could clear $7 million before anyone noticed, and by then, what could a confused old woman in a nursing home do about it? They'd been planning to steal my entire life's work and leave me to rot in some facility, forgotten and helpless. But here's what Tyler never understood about the woman who helped build Foster Consulting Group from nothing. When you corner someone who's spent decades fighting for everything she has, you don't get a victim. You get a very dangerous enemy. Once I knew the full scope of Tyler and Melissa's plan, I had to make the hardest decision of my life: pretend to be exactly the confused, helpless old woman they thought I was, while secretly preparing to destroy them both. It went against every fiber of my being. For 79 years, I'd prided myself on being sharp, independent, and strong. Now, I had to shuffle a little more when I walked, repeat myself occasionally, and act like I couldn't quite follow conversations that moved too quickly. I had to become their perfect victim while documenting every single crime they committed against me. The performance started the very next time Tyler visited. He came by with a stack of papers, claiming they were routine updates to my insurance policies. I put on my reading glasses, squinted at the documents like I was having trouble focusing, and asked him to explain everything in simple terms. What Tyler didn't realize was that I was photographing every page with the smartphone Kevin had taught me to use, while pretending to struggle with the complicated language. The documents weren't insurance updates at all. They were forms to liquidate more of my investment accounts and transfer the funds to accounts Tyler controlled. I signed them with a slightly shaky hand, playing the part of the trusting mother who couldn't understand modern financial instruments. Tyler patted my shoulder and told me I didn't need to worry about these boring details anymore, that he was taking care of everything. But the most devastating revelation came during what Tyler and Melissa thought was a private conversation in my kitchen while I was supposedly napping in the living room. They'd gotten so comfortable with their deception that they'd forgotten the most basic rule about elderly people. We might move slower, but our hearing is often better than you think. Melissa was practically gloating as she told Tyler about the nursing home visits she'd been making. She'd found several facilities that specialized in memory care, patients' places where families could drop off relatives and rarely visit without raising suspicions. She'd already put deposits down on 3 different options, telling the administrators that I was showing signs of dementia and would likely need to be placed within the next few months. Tyler's response made my blood freeze. He told Melissa that the timing was perfect because he'd just discovered that I owned more of Foster Consulting Group than he'd originally thought. He'd found some old documents that suggested I might actually have controlling interest in the company, not just a minority stake like he'd assumed. He said they needed to move fast before I figured out what those papers meant. That's when I realized Tyler's greatest mistake. He'd spent so much time treating me like an invalid that he'd completely forgotten I was the one who'd helped structure the original business deals. He had no idea that I understood exactly what those documents meant, or that I'd been keeping my own copies of everything in Douglas's safe. But the conversation that really broke my heart came a few days later, when Tyler brought his own son, my 15-year-old grandson Jake, to visit. Jake had always been close to me, and I could see he was uncomfortable with how his father was treating me. When Jake tried to talk to me about school, about his friends, Tyler quickly interrupted and told his son not to tire me out with too much conversation. After Jake left the room, Tyler told Melissa that they needed to start limiting my contact with family members who might ask inconvenient questions. He said Jake was getting old enough to notice things, and they couldn't risk him telling other relatives that Grandma seemed perfectly fine when they were claiming she was mentally incompetent. The casual way they discussed isolating me from my own grandson, using my supposed mental decline as an excuse to cut me off from everyone who loved me. That's when I knew there would be no mercy in what I was planning. Over the next 2 weeks, I played my part perfectly. I let Tyler help me organize my bills, giving him access to more account information while secretly photographing everything he did. I nodded along when Melissa explained why I needed to start thinking about transitioning to a care environment. I even let them drive me to tour to different nursing homes, acting impressed by facilities that smelled like disinfectant and despair. But every night, after they left, I was on the phone with Harold Chen, building the legal case that would destroy them. Every confused signature I gave Tyler was another piece of evidence that he was manipulating a woman he claimed was mentally incompetent. Every condescending explanation Melissa offered was more proof of their systematic abuse of an elderly person. The beautiful irony was that the more convinced they became of my helplessness, the more careless they became with their crimes. Tyler started forging my signature on documents without even bothering to show them to me first. Melissa began talking openly about redecorating our new house, meaning the house Tyler was planning to buy with my stolen money. They'd gotten so comfortable with their deception that they'd forgotten the most important lesson Douglas ever taught me about business. Never underestimate your opponent, especially when they're being quiet. The final test of my performance came the day Tyler announced he'd found the perfect place for me to live. Shady Pines wasn't just a nursing home, it was barely a step above a warehouse for unwanted elderly people. The smell hit you the moment you walked in the door. A combination of industrial cleaning products trying to mask something much worse underneath. As Tyler and Melissa walked me through the cramped room that would become my prison, explaining how much happier I'd be with professional care, I nodded and smiled and asked innocent questions about meal times and visiting hours. What they didn't see was the steel in my spine, or the fury building behind my gentle smile. They thought they were showing a confused old woman her final destination. They were actually giving their victim a detailed tour of the crime scene that would send them both to prison. The morning Tyler dumped me at Shady Pines and told me I'd rot there while he lived the life he deserved. I sat in that awful room for exactly 2 hours feeling sorry for myself. Then I remembered something Douglas used to say, Mari, the difference between victims and survivors is what they do in the first 24 hours after someone tries to destroy them. I wasn't going to be Tyler's victim for one more minute. The key to everything was Rosa Gonzalez, a night shift nurse who actually cared about the people warehoused in that place. When she found me crying in my room around midnight, she didn't just offer me tissues, she sat down and listened to my whole story. Rosa had been taking care of elderly people for 15 years, and she'd seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times. Adult children using safety concerns and diminished capacity to steal from parents who were sharper than they pretended to be. Rosa was the one who suggested I call Harold Chen, and she was the one who let me use her personal cell phone to make the call that changed everything. When Harold heard my voice at 2 a.m, explaining where I was and what Tyler had done, his response was immediate and furious. Harold had been Douglas's law partner before becoming our family attorney, and he'd watched Tyler grow up. He knew exactly what kind of man my son had become, and he'd been waiting for this call longer than I realized. Harold told me he'd been suspicious of Tyler's financial requests for months, but he'd needed proof before he could act. Now he had it. Within 6 hours, Harold had assembled what he called the team, not just lawyers, but forensic accountants, private investigators, and specialists in elder abuse cases. While Tyler was probably sleeping off his first night in some luxury European hotel, we were building the foundation of his destruction. The first step was getting me out of Shady Pines legally. Harold arrived at dawn with a court order and 2 security guards, claiming that I'd been placed there under false pretenses by someone who'd used fraudulent documents. The facility's administrator tried to argue, but Harold had done his homework. Tyler's power of attorney was invalid because it had been signed under duress while I was medically compromised, and no doctor had ever declared me mentally incompetent. By 8 a.m., I was free and sitting in Harold's office, finally able to think clearly without the smell of industrial disinfectant making me sick. But getting me out was just the beginning. Harold's forensic accountant, a brilliant woman named Sarah Kim, who specialized in financial fraud cases, had spent the night going through every transaction Tyler had made using my accounts. What she'd found was even worse than I'd imagined. Tyler hadn't just stolen $3.5 million from my personal accounts. He'd also been systematically embezzling from Foster Consulting Group for over a year, using his position as operational manager to redirect client payments into personal accounts. Melissa's fake consulting company had billed the business for nearly $300,000 in services that existed only on paper. But Sarah had found something else, something that made Harold's eyes light up with the kind of predatory satisfaction that comes from practicing law for 40 years. Tyler had been so confident in his scheme that he'd documented everything: email trails, bank records, even text messages between him and Melissa discussing how much money they could steal before I noticed. The beautiful irony was that Tyler's own arrogance had created a perfect paper trail of his crimes. Every forged signature, every fraudulent transfer, every fake invoice, it was all there, documented with the precision of someone who thought he was too clever to get caught. That's when Harold explained the nuclear option Douglas had prepared for exactly this situation. As the majority shareholder in Foster Consulting Group, I had the power to call an emergency board meeting and remove Tyler from all positions in the company. But Douglas had structured it even more brilliantly than that. The board included 3 independent members Tyler didn't even know existed, longtime business associates of Douglas, who'd agreed to serve as safeguards against exactly this kind of family betrayal. Harold had already contacted all 3 board members, and they were flying in from different parts of the country for an emergency meeting, scheduled for the day before Tyler was supposed to return from Europe. They were furious when they learned what Tyler had done, not just because of the theft, but because they'd respected Douglas and felt a personal obligation to protect his widow. But we needed more than just financial evidence. We needed to prove a pattern of elder abuse, psychological manipulation, and systematic isolation. That's where the private investigator came in. Detective Maria Santos was a former police officer who specialized in elder abuse cases, and she knew exactly how to build a criminal case that would stick. She spent 2 days interviewing everyone who'd witnessed Tyler's treatment of me over the past year: my neighbors, my doctor, my friends at church, even the staff at Shady Pines who'd been horrified by how Tyler had dumped me there. What Maria found was a clear pattern of psychological abuse designed to make me appear mentally incompetent, while Tyler positioned himself as the concerned son, forced to take control of his mother's affairs. Multiple witnesses confirmed that I'd seemed perfectly sharp and capable right up until Tyler started his campaign of isolation and control. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the physician who'd treated me for pneumonia. She confirmed that Tyler had pressured me to sign documents while I was running a high fever and barely conscious. She also revealed that Tyler had called her several times asking leading questions about my mental state, trying to get her to put concerns about my cognitive ability in my medical records. Dr. Martinez had refused to do it because she'd seen no evidence of mental decline, but Tyler's attempts to manipulate my medical records were clear evidence of premeditation. By the end of the first week, we had everything we needed to destroy Tyler legally and financially. But I wanted more than just justice. I wanted him to understand exactly how completely he'd underestimated the woman who'd helped build everything he was trying to steal. The final piece of the foundation was the most personal. Harold helped me track down Tyler's travel itinerary, and we discovered that he and Melissa were living like royalty in Europe: 5-star hotels, first-class flights, expensive restaurants, all charged to the Foster Consulting Group corporate credit card. Tyler was literally stealing from me to fund the vacation he was taking while I supposedly rotted in that nursing home. The arrogance was breathtaking, but it was also exactly the kind of evidence that would make a jury furious. As I sat in Harold's office that Friday night, exactly 1 week after Tyler had abandoned me, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Douglas died. the thrill of building something powerful and perfect. We weren't just preparing a legal case anymore. We were constructing Tyler's complete destruction, piece by piece, with the same precision Douglas and I had used to build our business empire decades earlier. Tyler thought he'd neutralized his biggest threat by locking me away where I couldn't interfere with his plans. What he'd actually done was give me the motivation and the time to prepare the most devastating counterattack of his life. He had 3 more weeks of vacation left, 3 more weeks of believing he'd won. I was going to make sure they were the last 3 weeks of freedom he'd have for a very long time. By the second week of Tyler's European vacation, while he was posting photos of himself and Melissa at the Colosseum on social media using stolen money, I was sitting in boardrooms with some of the most powerful people in the pharmaceutical consulting industry, watching them realize that Douglas Foster's son had betrayed everything his father had built. The emergency board meeting Harold had arranged wasn't just about removing Tyler from the company, it was about understanding how deep his corruption went and making sure it could never happen again. When the 3 independent board members Douglas had carefully selected arrived from Chicago, Atlanta, and Denver, their faces told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they were taking this situation. Robert Chun, Harold's older brother and a former pharmaceutical executive, had flown in from Chicago, specifically because he'd promised Douglas on his deathbed that he'd protect me if anything ever happened. Patricia Williams had driven down from Atlanta, bringing 30 years of experience in corporate fraud investigation, and James Morrison had taken the red-eye from Denver, carrying documents that would prove Tyler's embezzlement went back much further than any of us had imagined. What they discovered during that 8-hour meeting changed everything. Tyler hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been systematically destroying Douglas's legacy. He'd canceled contracts with longtime clients who'd been with the company since the beginning, replacing them with new clients who paid higher fees but demanded services the company couldn't actually provide. He'd been running Foster Consulting Group like a personal piggy bank, taking out massive loans against the company's assets and using the money to fund his and Melissa's lifestyle. But the most shocking discovery came when James Morrison opened his briefcase and pulled out financial records. That made my blood run cold. Tyler had been in secret negotiations to sell Foster Consulting Group to a corporate buyer for $12 million, nearly half of what the company was actually worth. The sale was structured so that Tyler would receive the majority of the proceeds as the managing partner, while I would get a small payout as a minority investor. Tyler was planning to sell Douglas's life's work for pennies on the dollar and keep most of the money for himself, all while I was supposedly rotting away in that nursing home, too confused to understand what was happening. The board's unanimous decision was swift and brutal. Tyler was immediately terminated for cause from all positions within the company. His corporate credit cards were canceled, his access to company accounts was revoked, and criminal charges would be filed for embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. But we didn't stop there. Patricia Williams had brought something that would make Tyler's nightmare complete: evidence that Melissa's consulting company had been billing not just Foster Consulting Group, but also 3 of our biggest clients for services that didn't exist. She'd been running a sophisticated fraud operation, using her access to company information to create fake invoices and forge contracts. The beautiful part was that Tyler had given Melissa access to everything, thinking he was being generous to his wife. What he'd actually done was make her a co-conspirator in multiple felonies across state lines, turning what could have been a simple embezzlement case into a federal crime. But I wanted to make sure Tyler understood exactly how completely he'd miscalculated who he was dealing with. So I asked Harold to do something that would have shocked Douglas, but would have made him proud at the same time. I authorized Harold to begin the process of not just prosecuting Tyler, but completely erasing him from any connection to the Foster family legacy. Harold explained that we could pursue what's called generational asset forfeiture, a legal process that would not only recover the money Tyler had stolen, but also permanently remove him from any inheritance claims, trust benefits, or family business interests. It meant that Tyler would lose not just what he'd already stolen, but everything he might have legitimately inherited in the future. It was the nuclear option Douglas had built into our family's legal structure, designed to protect the Foster legacy from exactly this kind of betrayal. Douglas had spent years with Harold creating legal mechanisms that could completely disinherit a family member who tried to steal from other family members. The paperwork for Tyler's complete legal and financial destruction was filed on a Tuesday morning while he was probably having breakfast at some cafe in Paris. By noon, every asset he thought he controlled was frozen. Every account he'd opened with stolen money was seized, and every contract he'd signed was under federal investigation. But the piece of evidence that would make Tyler's conviction inevitable came from an unexpected source: his own son, Jake. Harold had been trying to figure out how to document Tyler's psychological abuse and manipulation when Jake called me directly. The 15-year-old had been staying with Melissa's parents while his father was in Europe, and he'd finally worked up the courage to tell someone what he'd been witnessing at home. Jake had been recording conversations between Tyler and Melissa for months, initially just because he was worried about his grandmother and wanted to understand what was happening. What he'd captured was devastating. Hours of Tyler and Melissa discussing how to manipulate me, how to isolate me from family and friends, and how to make me appear mentally incompetent when I was actually perfectly sharp. The most damaging recording was from the night before Tyler took me to Shady Pines. Jake had hidden his phone in the kitchen and recorded Tyler telling Melissa that once they got rid of me, they'd have unlimited access to what he estimated was nearly $10 million in total assets. Tyler actually laughed while describing how easy it had been to convince me to sign documents I didn't understand. Jake was crying when he played me the recording, apologizing over and over for not speaking up sooner. I held that brave boy's hand and told him he'd just given his grandmother the weapon she needed to make sure his father never hurt anyone in our family again. Harold immediately contacted the FBI's Elder Abuse Task Force, and by Thursday, federal agents were building a case that would send both Tyler and Melissa to prison for years. The recordings Jake had made provided clear evidence of conspiracy, elder abuse, and premeditated fraud. But we still had one more card to play, one that would make Tyler's humiliation complete when he finally came home. Harold had discovered that Tyler's European vacation wasn't just being funded by stolen money, it was also being used as an opportunity to move assets offshore. Tyler had opened bank accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, apparently planning to hide his stolen millions where American authorities couldn't reach them. What Tyler didn't know was that international banking regulations had changed dramatically since Douglas's era. Every transaction Tyler made, every account he opened, every transfer he authorized was being tracked by financial intelligence agencies across 3 continents. His attempt to hide the money had actually created an ironclad paper trail that proved his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. By the time Tyler boarded his flight home from Paris, thinking he'd successfully pulled off the crime of the century, federal agents in 4 countries had already compiled enough evidence to put him away for decades. He was flying home to what he thought was his stolen kingdom. But what was actually waiting for him was a perfectly orchestrated trap that would destroy him completely. The boy who'd tried to steal his mother's empire was about to learn that the woman who'd helped build that empire knew exactly how to dismantle thieves who underestimated her. The final week of Tyler's vacation was when everything crystallized into the most beautiful trap I'd ever helped construct. While he was probably shopping for souvenirs in some Parisian boutique, I was putting the finishing touches on his complete destruction, and the timing was about to become absolutely perfect. Harold had been monitoring Tyler's credit card activity throughout his trip, and what we discovered was that my son's arrogance knew no bounds. He wasn't just spending stolen money on luxury hotels and expensive dinners. He was actually buying gifts for people back home, using my corporate credit card to purchase items he planned to give to friends and business associates as evidence of his success. Tyler had bought himself a $15,000 Rolex in Geneva, charged to Foster Consulting Group as a business expense. He'd purchased designer handbags for Melissa, totaling nearly $8,000, also billed to the company. He'd even bought expensive wine that he planned to serve at a party, celebrating his successful management of the family business. Every purchase was another nail in his coffin, but more importantly, every purchase told us exactly where he was and what he was planning. Harold had arranged for federal agents to track Tyler's movements through his credit card usage, and we knew down to the hour when he'd be arriving back in the United States. But the most crucial piece of timing came from an unexpected source: Tyler himself. In his supreme confidence that he'd successfully neutralized me, he'd been sending regular updates to the few business associates who still thought he was legitimately running Foster Consulting Group. His emails, which Harold's team was monitoring through the FBI's investigation, revealed that Tyler had scheduled a major presentation for the day after his return. Tyler was planning to announce the sale of Foster Consulting Group to that corporate buyer, presenting it as his brilliant strategy to maximize shareholder value while positioning himself as the visionary leader who'd engineered the deal. He'd even scheduled a celebration dinner at the city's most expensive restaurant, planning to toast his success with champagne that cost more per bottle than some people made in a week. What Tyler didn't know was that Harold had already contacted the corporate buyer and informed them that the person they'd been negotiating with had no legal authority to sell the company. The buyer's lawyers had immediately withdrawn their offer and were considering their own legal action against Tyler for fraud and misrepresentation. But we weren't done yet. Harold had one more surprise that would make Tyler's homecoming absolutely devastating. Through the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, we'd learned that Tyler had been telling people in Europe that he was the sole owner of a multi-million-dollar consulting company, using that fiction to gain access to exclusive business networks and high-end financial services. He'd actually applied for membership in an exclusive business club in London, listing himself as the CEO and primary shareholder of Foster Consulting Group. Tyler was so deep in his own lies that he'd started believing them. He genuinely thought he'd successfully stolen my company and erased me from the picture entirely. The final piece of the puzzle came from Maria Santos, the private investigator who'd been building the criminal case against Tyler. She'd been monitoring social media accounts and had discovered that Melissa had been posting constant updates about their incredible European adventure, including photos of luxury purchases and five-star accommodations. What made these posts legally devastating was that Melissa had tagged them with hashtags like #blessed, #hardworkpaysoff, #living-our-dreams, clearly suggesting that their lavish lifestyle was the result of legitimate success rather than theft from an elderly woman. Maria had also discovered that Melissa had been in contact with real estate agents, looking at multi-million-dollar homes that she planned to purchase with the money Tyler had stolen from me. She'd actually put down deposits on 2 different properties, telling the agents that her husband had just closed a major business deal that would allow them to upgrade their lifestyle dramatically. Every social media post, every real estate inquiry, every luxury purchase was creating an undeniable record of Tyler and Melissa's consciousness of guilt. They weren't just stealing money, they were celebrating their theft publicly, making it impossible for them to claim later that they'd acted innocently or made honest mistakes. But the most satisfying discovery came when Harold's forensic accountant uncovered Tyler's long-term financial planning. He'd been consulting with wealth management advisors about how to structure his inheritance to minimize tax liability and maximize investment returns. Tyler had actually hired expensive financial planners to help him manage the money he was planning to steal from me. The beautiful irony was that Tyler's own financial records proved premeditation beyond any doubt. He hadn't just opportunistically taken advantage of my supposed mental decline. He'd been planning this theft for over a year, carefully structuring his crime to maximize his profit and minimize his risk. Or so he thought. By the Thursday before Tyler's return, we had assembled what Harold called the most complete elder abuse prosecution package he'd ever seen. Financial crimes, federal wire fraud, interstate embezzlement, conspiracy, money laundering, and elder abuse charges across multiple jurisdictions. Tyler was looking at potential sentences that could keep him in prison for the rest of his life. But I wanted more than just legal victory. I wanted Tyler to understand, in the most visceral way possible, that he'd underestimated exactly the wrong person. That's when Harold suggested something that made me smile for the first time since this nightmare began. Instead of having Tyler arrested at the airport like a common criminal, we could wait until his planned presentation meeting and let him walk into a room full of FBI agents, board members, and prosecutors. Tyler was planning to arrive home on a Friday, rest over the weekend, and then stride into that conference room on Monday morning, expecting to announce his triumphant sale of the company. Instead, he'd be walking into the most humiliating ambush in corporate crime history. But Harold had saved the best surprise for last. Through the FBI's cooperation with international law enforcement, they'd arranged for Tyler's Swiss and Cayman Islands accounts to be frozen the moment his flight touched down on American soil. Every penny he thought he'd hidden offshore would be seized before he even made it through customs. Tyler was flying home thinking he'd won the lottery, but he was actually returning to a country where every asset he'd touched was frozen. Every crime he'd committed was documented, and every lie he'd told was about to be exposed in open court. The trap was perfect, the timing was flawless, and the justice was going to be absolutely devastating. Tomorrow, Tyler Foster would learn that when you try to destroy a woman who spent 50 years building empires, you better make sure she's actually as helpless as you think she is. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that makes everything seem possible. And as I sat in my car outside the Foster Consulting Group offices at 7:30 a.m., watching Tyler's BMW pull into the parking space marked CEO, a title he'd never legally held, I felt the same electric anticipation I used to get before closing a major business deal with Douglas. Tyler looked exactly like what he was, a man who thought he'd gotten away with the perfect crime. His tan was deep from a month of European sunshine bought with stolen money, his suit was clearly expensive and new, and he carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed he'd successfully destroyed his own mother and inherited an empire. He was actually whistling as he walked toward the building, carrying a briefcase that I knew contained presentation materials for the company's sale he thought he was about to announce. What Tyler didn't notice were the 3 unmarked cars in the parking lot, or the fact that every window in the building's conference room was filled with faces he didn't recognize. He was so focused on his moment of triumph that he missed all the signs that his world was about to collapse. Harold had timed everything perfectly. Tyler would walk into that conference room expecting to find the usual collection of mid-level managers and administrative staff he'd been dealing with for the past year. Instead, he'd find the FBI's Elder Abuse Task Force, federal prosecutors, the 3 independent board members he didn't know existed, Harold's entire legal team, Detective Maria Santos, and me. I'd insisted on being there personally. After what Tyler had put me through, after the humiliation of being dumped in that nursing home and told I'd rot there while he lived off my stolen money, I wanted to see his face when he realized exactly how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. At 8 a.m. sharp, Tyler strode through the main entrance like he owned the place. In his mind, he did own it. He'd spent a month in Europe convinced that his confused, helpless mother was locked away in some facility, too mentally incompetent to interfere with his plans. He was about to discover that the woman he'd tried to destroy had spent that same month building the most comprehensive criminal case in the history of elder abuse prosecution. Harold had positioned himself in the reception area, and when Tyler saw him, I watched through the window as my son's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to the first flicker of fear. Harold simply told Tyler that there had been some changes while he was away, and that the board had called an emergency meeting that required Tyler's immediate attention. Tyler tried to bluster, demanding to know why he hadn't been informed of any board meeting, insisting that he was the one who called meetings and set agendas. Harold just smiled and told him that everything would be explained in the conference room. The walk down that hallway was probably the longest 30 seconds of Tyler's life. I could see him through the glass walls, his confident stride gradually slowing as he began to process that something was very, very wrong. By the time he reached the conference room door, his cocky swagger had disappeared entirely. When Tyler opened that door and saw me sitting at the head of the conference table, healthy, alert, and obviously not rotting in any nursing home, the color drained from his face so completely that I thought he might faint. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and the expensive briefcase slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. I let him stand there for a full 10 seconds, taking in the room full of federal agents and prosecutors, before I spoke the words I'd been rehearsing for weeks. I told Tyler that I'd spent the last month learning some very interesting things about what he'd been doing while I was supposedly too confused to understand my own financial affairs. I explained that his power of attorney had been invalid from the moment he'd coerced me into signing it while I was medically compromised, making every transaction he'd conducted a separate count of fraud and elder abuse. Tyler tried to interrupt, stammering something about acting in my best interests, about being concerned for my safety, about making responsible decisions for someone who couldn't make them herself. I held up my hand for silence and continued. I informed Tyler that the FBI had been monitoring his European vacation, tracking every fraudulent purchase he'd made with stolen money, every illegal transfer to offshore accounts, every lie he'd told to foreign financial institutions. I explained that his attempt to hide assets internationally had actually made his crimes federal offenses with mandatory minimum sentences. But the moment that broke Tyler completely was when I revealed that we had Jake's recordings, when I told Tyler that his own 15-year-old son had been so horrified by his father's behavior that he'd secretly documented months of conversations between Tyler and Melissa. Tyler's legs actually gave out and he collapsed into a chair. Agent Rebecca Morrison from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit took over at that point, formally reading Tyler his rights while Harold's forensic accountant laid out the evidence on the conference table. $3.5 million in personal theft, $800,000 in corporate embezzlement, $300,000 in fraudulent billing through Melissa's fake company, an attempted wire fraud involving $12 million in illegal asset sales. Tyler kept looking at me throughout the arrest process, his eyes pleading for some kind of mercy, some indication that this was all a misunderstanding that could be worked out within the family. I stared back at him with the cold fury of a woman who'd spent 79 years building something worthwhile, only to watch her own son try to tear it all down for his personal profit. Agent Morrison explained that Melissa was being arrested simultaneously at their home, where agents were executing search warrants and seizing all assets purchased with stolen money. Tyler's Swiss and Cayman Islands accounts had already been frozen, and international authorities were preparing additional charges related to money laundering and tax evasion. The federal prosecutor, a sharp woman named Lisa Chen who specialized in elder abuse cases, informed Tyler that given the scope and premeditation of his crimes, the government would be seeking the maximum possible sentences. She explained that elder abuse was a federal priority and that Tyler's case would be prosecuted as an example to anyone else who thought they could prey on vulnerable seniors. But I saved the most devastating revelation for last. As the FBI agents prepared to escort Tyler out of the building in handcuffs, I stood up and told him that the board had voted unanimously to remove him from all positions and permanently ban him from any association with Foster Consulting Group. I explained that I was exercising Douglas's nuclear option, completely disinheriting Tyler from any future family assets and legally severing his connection to the Foster legacy. Tyler finally found his voice, desperately trying to explain that he'd never meant to hurt me, that he'd just been worried about my safety, that everything he'd done was motivated by love and concern for my well-being. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, this person I'd loved unconditionally for 52 years, and told him the truth that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I told Tyler that when he'd looked me in the eye at that nursing home and said I'd rot there while he lived the life he deserved, he'd revealed exactly who he really was, and the woman he'd tried to destroy was exactly the wrong person to underestimate. As they led Tyler away in handcuffs, past employees who'd respected him and clients who'd trusted him, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Douglas died, the satisfaction of a job perfectly executed. Tyler had gambled that his elderly mother was too weak, too confused, and too isolated to fight back against his betrayal. He'd just learned that some gambles carry consequences that last the rest of your life. 6 months later, as I sat on the terrace of my new penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, sipping champagne that cost more than Tyler used to make in a week, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that awful day when my own son told me I'd rot in a nursing home while he lived off my stolen money. The legal proceedings had moved with surprising speed once the FBI took over the case. Tyler's attempt to plea bargain had been rejected immediately. The evidence was too overwhelming, the crimes too systematic, and the elder abuse too egregious for prosecutors to show any mercy. The federal government wanted to make an example of Tyler Foster, and they succeeded spectacularly. Tyler was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. The judge, a woman in her 70s who clearly took elder abuse personally, had listened to impact statements from me, from Jake, and from other elderly victims whose cases had been discovered during the investigation. When she handed down the sentence, she told Tyler that his crimes represented a betrayal of the most fundamental human bonds, and that society would not tolerate adults who preyed on their own parents. Melissa received 8 years, and the judge made it clear that her sentence was lighter, only because she'd been following Tyler's lead rather than originating the scheme. Both of them were ordered to pay full restitution, though since they'd already spent most of the stolen money, that restitution would come from their future earnings for the rest of their working lives. But the most satisfying moment came when Tyler's assets were liquidated to pay back what he'd stolen. That $15,000 Rolex he'd bought himself in Geneva, sold at auction, with the proceeds going directly back into my accounts. The designer handbags Melissa had charged to my corporate credit card, seized and sold, every penny recovered. The expensive wine Tyler had planned to serve at his celebration party, donated to charity, because I thought Douglas would have appreciated the irony. The sale of Foster Consulting Group had taken longer to arrange, But Harold had found the perfect buyer, pharmaceutical consulting firm in Boston, whose founders had actually worked with Douglas in the early days. They understood the company's legacy and were committed to maintaining the ethical standards Douglas had built into every aspect of the business. The final sale price was $26 million, nearly double what Tyler had been planning to accept from his corrupt buyer. Jake had been the most difficult part of this entire ordeal, because watching his father's arrest and imprisonment had devastated that brave 15-year-old boy. But Jake was also the hero of this story, and I made sure he understood that. The recordings he'd made hadn't just saved me, they'd prevented Tyler from victimizing other elderly people who might have fallen for similar schemes in the future. I'd set up a college fund for Jake that would cover not just his undergraduate education but medical school if he chose to pursue it. More importantly, I'd made sure he understood that his actions had shown more courage and integrity than most adults ever demonstrate. Jake would carry the shame of his father's crimes for the rest of his life, but he'd also carry the pride of knowing he'd done the right thing when it mattered most. The money recovery had been almost complete. Between the criminal restitution, the asset seizures, and the successful sale of the company, I'd actually ended up in a stronger financial position than I'd been in before. Tyler's betrayal, but more importantly, I'd learned something about myself that I hadn't realized since Douglas died. I was still capable of fighting for what mattered, still sharp enough to outmaneuver people who underestimated me, still strong enough to build something new from the wreckage of betrayal. At 79 years old, I'd discovered that my life wasn't ending, it was beginning again. The penthouse apartment in Manhattan had been my first major purchase after the legal settlements were finalized. After spending decades in the suburban house where Douglas and I had raised Tyler, I'd realized I wanted to be somewhere that held no memories of my son's childhood, no reminders of the man I'd thought he was before I learned who he really was. The apartment was everything I'd never allowed myself to want: floor-to-ceiling windows, a modern kitchen where I could cook for friends, a library where I could read without interruption, and a terrace where I could watch the city change with the seasons. It was a home for the woman I'd become, not the woman I used to be. But the real transformation had been in how I spent my time. Instead of rattling around in a house that had become too big and too quiet after Douglas's death, I was traveling, learning, and building new relationships with people who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide for them. I'd taken that trip to Paris that Tyler had planned to enjoy with my stolen money. But I'd done it properly: first-class flights, 5-star hotels, and private tours of museums that Douglas and I had always dreamed of visiting together. Standing in the Louvre, looking at paintings that had survived for centuries through wars and revolutions and human betrayal, I'd felt connected to something larger than my own family's drama. I'd also started volunteering with the Elder Abuse Prevention Network, sharing my story with other seniors who were facing manipulation from their own family members. The number of elderly people dealing with financial abuse from adult children was staggering, and many of them felt too ashamed or too confused to fight back. I'd become something of a poster child for fighting back against elder abuse, speaking at conferences and working with law enforcement to identify the warning signs of family financial fraud. The foundation I'd established with $2 million from the settlement was already helping dozens of elderly victims pursue legal action against family members who'd tried to steal from them. We'd hired Harold's law firm to handle cases pro bono, and we'd partnered with the FBI to train local police departments in recognizing elder abuse tactics. Every time we helped another 70 or 80-year-old grandmother recover money that her own children had stolen, every time we sent another Tyler Foster to prison for preying on a parent, I thought about Douglas and how proud he would have been of what I'd built from the ashes of our son's betrayal. But the most unexpected gift had been the relationship I'd developed with Rosa Gonzalez, the night nurse at Shady Pines who'd helped me make that first phone call to Harold. Rosa had left that horrible facility and was now working as a private care coordinator, helping families find legitimate, high-quality care for elderly relatives. I'd hired her company to help me establish a network of truly excellent senior living facilities, places where people could age with dignity instead of being warehoused like unwanted furniture. As I sat on my terrace that evening, watching the sun set over Manhattan while planning my next trip, this time to Australia, another destination Douglas and I had talked about but never visited, I thought about the letter Tyler had sent me from prison 3 months earlier. He'd written pages and pages of apology, claiming he'd never meant to hurt me, insisting that he'd just made some bad decisions but still loved me as much as ever. He'd begged me to visit him, to give him a chance to explain himself in person, to consider forgiving him for the sake of our family relationship. I'd read the letter once and thrown it away. Not because I was incapable of forgiveness, but because Tyler still didn't understand what he'd actually done. He thought this was about money, about some bad financial decisions that had gotten out of hand. He had no comprehension that he'd tried to erase my entire identity, to reduce me to a confused old woman whose thoughts and feelings didn't matter anymore. Tyler had looked me in the eye and told me I'd rot in that nursing home while he lived the life he deserved. That wasn't a financial crime, that was a complete rejection of my worth as a human being, and that, I realized, was something I could never forgive. Tonight, as I raised my champagne glass to toast the city lights spreading out below my terrace, I thought about all the elderly people out there who were being told by their own children that their time was over, that they should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they were allowed to keep. I wanted them to know that age doesn't mean weakness, that being 70 or 80 or 90 doesn't mean you have to accept being treated as less than human. I wanted them to understand that sometimes the best revenge against people who underestimate you is proving exactly how wrong they were. If my story has touched something in your heart, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below, and tell me about your own experiences with family, with aging, with fighting for the respect you deserve. And please, subscribe to hear more stories like mine, because every grandmother, every grandfather, every senior citizen has tales of strength and wisdom that need to be shared with the world. At 79 years old, I've learned that the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to write your ending is to pick up the pen and write a better story yourself. And my story, I'm happy to say, is far from over.